Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk to you about chaos today. Hopefully, at the end of this presentation, you have a better definition of what chaos is, a better concept about how chaos translates in creative agencies, and probably be willing to watch Jurassic Park a second time. Yeah, so let's go. But first, I'm going to ask you a question. Why do you think the weatherman always gets the weather wrong? Some ideas? It's because it's such an unpredictable. Yes, thank you. You just win a cookie. So the truth is, it's not because the weatherman is a very unprofessional person and doesn't do his job. It's because the atmosphere is a chaotic system. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, what the hell is she talking about? If we want to define chaotic system as the mathematical definition, I first want to step back to what chaos is, like the true definition of chaos. So if I say chaos to you, what is the first word that comes to your mind?
Everything through each other, mixed up.
Mixed up, exactly. That's the first definition of chaos. It's kind of a messy confusion state where nobody understands what's happening. And that's the definition, that's what I would call the human definition, because it expresses something we experience or we feel. But the truth is, the original term behind chaos comes from Greco-Roman tradition, and that is the unordered state of matter in classical accounts of cosmogony, so basically, most of the time, the void before the universe existed. Okay, so now we're pretty deep into abstract things. Let's go one step deeper. There's also a mathematical definition to chaos, that is the behavior of iterative nonlinear systems in which arbitrarily small variations in initial conditions become magnified over time. Okay, let's make this simpler. I'm going to try to explain this with simpler words. Chaotic systems, mathematical chaotic systems, are systems that are highly sensitive to initial condition. So if you change one little thing somewhere, it can trigger a chain of effect that makes like completely unpredictable changes. That's what we call chaos theory. So chaos theory was discovered in the last century, and it's one of the greatest discovery because it helps scientists understand and model the chaotic system that we couldn't understand before. In other words, that's also what we call the butterfly effect. So the idea that a flap of wings in Japan can trigger a hurricane on the other side of the world. Now, how does this comes back to that atmosphere and that chaotic thing? Well, if you let's say that you're taking a thermometer and you want to measure temperature and make a model that will give you your weather forecast from that. Well, if you have a thermometer that's precise to 0.000001 degree, that errors that's triggered by this imprecision can trigger completely different forecast. So if you would run your weather model with 50.000001 degree or 50.00002 degrees, you'll end up with things that are completely different. Okay, so there's chaos in nature, but there's also chaos in organization, or you can find patterns that resembles chaotic system in organization. And an example of this is at Claire Franke, our resource management system or tool is called Forecast. And I don't think that's a coincidence. You could find a pattern that resembles chaotic system in resource management. So for example, if I'm on an important project and this morning I have a back accident and I have to stay 3 months in the hospital, that's going to completely shuffle the whole project planning that my project manager made, and it triggers a chain of effect like this as well. But is there any resource manager in the room? So I can say pretty loudly, well, resource management is very boring, so let's switch to creative projects, which I think we're more interested in. To explain how chaos comes from in creative project, I'm going to use a physical metaphor. So this is a pendulum. Pendulum moves, right? The movement of that pendulum is 100% defined by mathematical equations. So you can always predict where that black ball will be at any time. If you draw the trajectory of that pendulum, this is what you get. And the idea is that if I would throw two pendulums next to each other, separated from 1 degree angle, they would move with the same movement, right? They would follow each other for a while and then stop. Now, if you add an extra arm to the pendulum, then suddenly that becomes a chaotic system mathematically. And if you draw the trajectory, this is how it looks. So in that second case, if you would throw two pendulums with 1 degree angle at the beginning, they would follow each other for maybe, 1 second, and then completely go in separate directions. So what's the difference between the first and the second case? Why is it that just adding an arm creates such a difference in the output? Well, the difference between the first and the second one is that you added a degree of freedom to your pendulum. And the more degrees of freedom, the more chaotic. Now, how does this translate to creative process? Well, let's say this is your creative process. So this is you on a Sunday making art. Super cool. When you are in a creative agency, you can't go around like that forever. You need to deliver at some point. So you need that chaotic process to converge towards the delivery. So how do you do this? Well, you need to slowly reduce the number of degrees of freedom from your project. Let's call this boundaries. Your boundaries at the very beginning of your project are the requirements of your client. And the more you go into your project, the more there are also decisions that you took internally to make your project advance. For example, we'll use these 3 primary colors, or we'll use this set of fonts, for example. And when you do this, at some point, you end up with a delivery. Now, those boundaries here, they're not solid rock. You can do this. You can go outside of it, explore options, and bring back your inspiration inside the boundaries of your project. For example, 2 years ago at CleverFranco, we had a project with Red Bull. It was a party at the ADE where people would have a sensor attached to their wrist that would track their movement, temperature, noise, and all that during the party. And we wanted to create a personal visualization of each person's journey through the party. And this visualization came out not from a designer mind that thought this is how it's going to look, but from the exploration of my fellow programmers colleagues that thought, let's try to do random things. And at some point it ended up with this. And it's the fact that we went outside and explored a visualization that's kind of unusual that made this output in the end. Now, I have to say, as I was introduced as a data analyst, so I'm not really a creative person. We can discuss what creative person means after if you want. But this is more how I think. So when I have to solve a problem, I have a starting point, a delivery, and I create in my mind a step-by-step process that's very analytical and very optimized to go towards delivery. So that works super fine if you have to solve an analytical problem. But when you have to solve creative problems, you're a little bit too in that straight mode and strict. You have trouble getting out of your ideal path. And that was really true in a project we recently finished at CleverFranco that's called the weather chart. So CleverFranco weather chart is a self-initiated project, an internal project. It's a series of posters that visualize weather data from new perspective and with innovative visualization. So we have 5 in the series, and the 5th one on the left is the one that we finished recently. For example, the first one we made visualized the weather elements every day of the year in Utrecht. The 4th one visualized the global ranking of countries over 50 years of data based on average temperature. So it's this kind of thing. So they come in the shape of posters that are double-sided and visualize data in new way, weather data from new way, from new angles, a new perspective. So what are the boundaries of this project? It's an internal project, so by definition, the boundaries are very, very, very wide, because it's a project where we also want to leave space for freedom, space for innovation. So in terms of design, the design boundaries are, it has to be a 60 per 100 poster, it has to be double-sided and talk about the USA and Netherlands. It has to visually integrate with previous weather charts. And I love this one, it has to have a monumental feel. So in the sense that you could hang it in your living room or hang it in a museum. So a very abstract requirement. And the data boundaries are, of course, it has to involve weather data. It has to be about the USA and the Netherlands, and it should be a different perspective or angle from the previous weather charts. So when we thought about this 5th weather chart concept, we imagined it as being something a little bit more human. So can you raise your hand if you use a bike to move in your city? Cool. Can you keep your hand raised if you've ever postponed going somewhere of 5 to 10 minutes because it was pouring rain outside? Okay, so we're all very familiar with this because, well, we live in Netherlands, so everybody bikes, and it rains 110% of the time. But it's not, when I realized that, I thought, wait a minute, this is actually very interesting because the fact that the weather was bad impacted my decision not to leave. So the weather had an impact on my decision. And it has an impact kind of in most of the things I do. Every morning, I check by an alarm to decide how I'm going to dress up. Or if it's super sunny, maybe I'm going to pack my lunch and go eat in the park on a Sunday. So we thought, okay, there are domains of our life that have a conscious or unconscious weather parameter in the equation, where the weather can play a role into your decision. But those are small variations, they're not very big. You're going to leave 5 minutes after to avoid that peak of rain. So we ask ourselves, can we quantify this? Can we quantify the influence of weather on our lives? So I started to look for data. I crushed some data sets and all that to try to find insights, to try to find stories that are interesting to tell about how weather impacts your life without even you knowing sometimes. And while I was doing this, and as it says in the name, is data analysis, so it's very analytical, my fellow designers, colleagues, were figuring out concept design. And this is how their research looks like. You will slowly see the design converge towards the final result. And well, I love this GIF. It's a piece of beauty. I'm gonna look at it another time because it's so satisfying to see it converging towards that final thing. I can't find a better illustration of that chaotic process converging towards the final result because it's just visually there. And as you see it converge, you also see the moment where some critical decisions were made that are shaping the final result. For example, so these were the boundaries. At some point, we decided to use the square as the key visual element. The reason for that is because we have sections of maps that are more or less zoomed in. So we use the square as like a little bit like on Google Maps. When you have your square, you're zooming in. And we thought we're going to reuse the shape everywhere. And when we made that decision, then we reduced the degree of freedom. Because then all the visual elements are derived from that shape. So when you're building a graph or anything, you know that you're going to use a square for everything. But the boundaries and the chaos can also get reduced from a data perspective. Like at some point, I was asked to find topics on the influence of weather on our lives that would be the same for the USA and Netherlands. And I had to say, well, that's not possible because the data sources are not identical. The concept and the context are different. So this is not going to happen. We'll have to have different topics from both countries. And this is it. This is the result. It's a beautiful piece of data visualization. But I have to say, when I started on this project, It was my first project at Clara Franca. It was my first creative project. And it was the first time I worked with creative people. And all my life, I've been surrounded by math nerds and geeks. So it was really, for me, completely new to work with creative people. And I didn't know how to approach it at first, because it's a completely different way of solving things and of thinking things that I was used to. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, this is actually how this whole process looked. There was creative people like creating this mess around me. And I was in the middle as the pillar of truth. And I think I think that's particularly true in data-driven creative process, where you're creating your design and your visualization around the data, and the data is your source of truth. It's the thing you build around. And at some point I was like, okay, so the data becomes the thing that the design revolves around, and you're actually helping making that chaos a little bit harnessed, because you're making it revolved around that source of truth and not just going anywhere. So I found this image super cool, and I'm going to go one level of abstraction, so follow me. The chaotic system that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, when you have chaotic system in nature or like atmosphere, for example, and if you plot it over time, you always see a shape where you have an attractor in the middle and the system are revolving around these attractors. A bit like that. It's not like that, but it's a bit like that. And these attractors, when they're strange, we call them strange attractors, they create fractals. So fractals, they're a mathematical object, and when you visualize them, it looks a little bit like this. It's an object that it doesn't depend how well you're zoomed in, you always get the same shape forever and ever and ever. So you can zoom in as much as possible on that shape, you always see the same shape. And they're beautiful. I mean, in general, people find this beautiful. You might think that this is rubbish, but fractals are usually considered as beautiful. So when you have chaotic system and you have a strange attractor in it, you end up with a beautiful fractal. Well, if you change these words by creative minds plus analytical minds, you end up with beautiful projects. That's a little bit far-fetched, okay. I think this is particularly true in data-driven design, where you really need that analytical data as the core and your creativity and craziness around it to make it look beautiful. And it ends up with beautiful projects. Thank you.